Sorry, it's not so easy to pronounce it. So let's welcome the acting director of French office in Taipei, Guillaume.
Thank you, Professor. I know my name is not easy to pronounce. Liu Zhang, Cai Chuzhang, Li Lao Shi, 各位贵宾，网络上的朋友们，早安。Ladies and gentlemen, other speakers today would probably speak a lot better than I about the sheer magnitude of all of the challenges that we will be facing through climate change. So let me not get into that. We have seen the floods that my predecessor has outlined. All of the examples are in the news already every day. These facts, it means, should be scaring us, because a lot of the news that we are reading are quite very depressing. However, we believe in France that these facts should not scare us into resignation, but into action. Because despite the number and size of the challenges, there is quite a lot of reasons for hope. First of all, the mobilization of the international community, while late, obviously, has been exceptional. And I'm not saying this only because the Paris Agreement was signed in Paris, therefore my country. It was signed with the whole international community, all of the possible stakeholders, everybody from developed economy to the least advanced states, the developing industrial powerhouses such as Taiwan. Everybody was partaking in this agreement, which is the first universal agreement, the first agreement that tackles energy, even though the word is not said once, the first agreement which is dynamic, with objectives for each of the stakeholders to be revised every 5 years, and the agreement which is just and fair because it organizes an unprecedented level of transfer of know-how and financial resources to the weakest countries to help them meet common goals. 189 countries now have ratified it, and it has become a foreign policy priority for France and for the EU, including through a lot of EU action that my predecessor has alluded to, that another speaker later on will develop much better than I, so I will allow myself not to delve too much onto the EU dimension. To those who are telling us that we should be depressed because the US has withdrawn its signature to the agreement, we believe that there is more need for action than ever, and that we should work not without our American friends, but together with all of the many leading forces in American civil society, which today are taking the challenge up, and they are being very active. To those also who believe that science does not have solutions for the type of problems that we have in front of us, we, France and the EU, reply that technological landscape is already evolving before our eyes, and that most of the needed technologies are already mature, are present here in the ground. Those also who claim that citizens don't care, don't believe in scientists, or can't comprehend the very technicality and complexity of these issues, we reply that there are enough examples that when they are given simple explanations, when they are given sensible and human-centered solutions, that citizens will be following it. Just look in 2019 at the green wave of politicians that was elected in the Green Parliament, a green wave of politicians that was elected in the French municipalities in this spring, and we can see that citizens do believe in the necessity to act. Interesting in this respect is a civil experiment that was tested in France this spring, which we called the Citizens Commission for the Climate, which was a group of citizens handpicked, ranging from teenage school pupils to bus drivers to retired railway staff, and they were asked to define government environmental policy for the years coming, especially how to cut the country's carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. And the result of this frank and open dialogue was surprisingly ambitious, despite the fact that we are told that citizens are too conservative. So the issue now is, how can cities act? And in the second part, I will be delving into how Taiwanese cities can and must act. How can cities act in general? We have to say that ever since maybe 1945, there has been an increasing complexity of modern societies and economies, which means that often politicians and civil society are left behind, and that decisions are left to experts, the real experts, especially at national and sometimes supranational level. And this is scary for a lot of us. However, we need to recognize that because maybe those matters are becoming more and more and more complex, that even at national or supranational level, you cannot deal with it alone. And that today, political action requires working together, each of us, with each of our specific specialties and technical knowledge. Just the attendance in this room is showing how we have people from very diverse backgrounds, that each of us, from the industry to agriculture to the very scientific measurement of climate action to political action, we can all bring a piece into the game. And only at local government level do we have the mastery and do we manage to make all of this knowledge into concrete action. This would be maybe my most important point for today. Local governments can play a huge role, for instance, in filling in for the lack of leadership at the national level. I have mentioned it in the US case. We are seeing many cities around the US that are taking very ambitious goals, that are working together with all stakeholders, and that are building momentum. And it is interesting to recognize the international networks around the world, networks of cities, such as the C40 that was presided until last year by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, the R20 network of regions for climate change. All of them are together acting to build collective action. And cities can also act through their sister city arrangements to be working between developed and developing countries, to be bringing support, financial support, knowledge support, transfer of know-how, and to help build adaptation and climate transition strategies. Just one example, the French region of Poitou-Charentes is helping a city in Indonesia called Kendari with its urban diagnostic, water management, and environmental education planning. Most importantly, again, let me stress it, while national governments can best design overall goals, and I believe, thank you, Guido, for saying this very clearly about the overall goals that were fixed by the Netherlands, they can also help identify priorities and mostly financing, because there will be a lot of that needed. It is local governments, together with all stakeholders, that can best mobilize the joint energy of all of the actors around the table that are responsible together for climate action. Taking now the case study of a few local governments and especially cities in France, it is interesting that our own legal framework on climate change has identified the regions that we have that are roughly the size of a Chinese province as the leaders on energy control, while the metropoles, which are groupings of cities approximately the size of a Taiwanese city, are responsible on their side for climate transition. And in this aspect, actually, there is interesting comparisons to make between some of the cases that I'm going to outline and the review that Mr. Fan Chang has outlined for Taipei. First example, an example of Paris. I won't get into all of the points because I see that my time is already running out, but in 2017, Paris has inaugurated the first 3 of what it calls îlots de fraîcheur, or cooling islets, which are specifically adapted public spaces where people can enjoy a carefully but naturally cooled environment during the blazing summer heats. And gradually, these islands of coolness are linked up one to the next throughout the city, providing respite from some of the future heat waves that we will be experimenting. It is interesting that through not only transportation, green networks of transportation, but also the very way that you design the city, can you be participating. These are examples that Mr. Fan Chang has also pointed in Taipei. A second example of a city in France is my home city of Rouen. Sorry, it's very difficult to pronounce the word. It's an innovating example of organizing its own local climate change conference, which in a way is reminiscent of what Professor Yatsuka Kataoka has described for the VLRs on the Global Sustainable Development Goals. My city of Rouen has organized not only its own scientific assessment of the local costs of climate change and of the popular attitudes towards that challenges, but it has also gathered all of the stakeholders, not on the diagnostic alone, but also on the actions that are needed, so that in November 2018, they signed their own Rouen Agreement for climate action, which is complete with a whole list of sectoral and individual commitments by every partner, which can be grouped into 9 strategic coalitions, a little bit reminiscent of your arguments, Guido, on how do you get in a specific sector, on a specific type of action, some actors together. Let me cite some of those individual coalitions. There would be agriculture as well, housing, individual mobility, biodiversity, circular economy, and everything. Third example, at the other end of the Paris metropolis is Grenoble in the Alps region, for those who don't know it, near Italy and Switzerland. The EU Commission has ranked Grenoble first or second on 11 of the 12 indicators for local climate change all throughout Europe. And some examples, in Grenoble, CO2 emissions have decreased 23% already from 2005. 320 kilometers of bike path have been created. 100% of its diesel buses will be replaced by clean buses by 2022. And an interesting public-private partnership, which I thought was interesting to pinpoint because it can suit a city like Taipei in as far as both cities are sharing a similar mountain basin type of framework and location, is a project that is to be finalized in 2023 for a 3.7 cable car transportation system in the center of the city. Cable cars look to be something very antiquated that you don't really need anymore, but you can actually make it not only reliable, quiet, and also with the least of CO2 emissions, a little bit like the system that Taipei is maintaining in Maokong. Now, precisely with mentioning Maokong, let me slide to how Taiwanese cities can and should play their role. There will be lots of people to say that the challenges between our two countries are maybe different. I don't agree with that. On the contrary, we saw examples of how Taiwan can be at risk of the land falling under the sea. We have seen how Taiwan has specific challenges as an island, but many territories and many French or Dutch people, for that matter, live in islands that have the same problems about loss of biodiversity, water scarcity, waste management, and others. And at least in Taipei, in Taiwan in general, you have very strong popular backing, you have a very strong manufacturing base, you have lots of capital available, and you are able that way, despite the drawbacks that we're getting from the COVID situation, to bring all of the necessary instruments together to be able to act together. And I want to tell you that in this fight, France and the EU in general, we will hear of the EU intervener later on, want to be on your side. We are working at the EU level on awareness raising. Every year we have a Climate Action Week, which is working with all types of stakeholders, especially the youth, which hasn't been mentioned until now, but needs to be involved in the discussion because we are talking about their future. Local government collaborations. The city of Grenoble that I mentioned before is part of the Go Smart Alliance of smart cities with Taipei, but also through all of the companies and the private sector. I want to mention just two. They are traditional but also innovative companies that can be participating together. Air Liquide is a French company that has been present in Taiwan as early as 1987, has a joint venture with Far Eastern Group for the supply of high-purity gases to the semiconductor industry. Well, its largest investment to date was just announced in April for 200 million euros, which is supplying 3 large semiconductor factories and R&D centers with gas units, 2 of which will be producing green hydrogen. Similarly, the French banks, such as BNP Cardiff and Crédit Agricole, represent today the largest green finance, I am finishing, supporters of Taiwan's energy transition plans. Green finance will be an important element because obviously we cannot do this only with our limited resources of today. And let me finish with innovation, which will be important. Today, the French company Unabis has developed several intelligent car park systems in Taiwan, and it works with mass retail chains such as 7-Eleven to be controlling their cold distribution chains. My message, therefore, in the end is, cities of the world, you can unite because the time is ripe for action. Only with you is there hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since